Greetings, friends, and welcome to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion production. I'm JJ Kimchi. Avraham Ibn Ezra, who lived and wrote in the 12th century, was one of the most creative, wide-ranging, and influential Jewish intellectuals of his period. A renowned poet, philosopher, grammarian, polemicist, and biblical exegete, Ibn Ezra has remained a much beloved, often quoted, and oftentimes controversial figure in the centuries since his death. Over the coming weeks, we are proud to present a mini-series of in-depth conversations on this splendidly enigmatic individual, with the hope that we may begin to illuminate the range and depth of his ideas. In the first conversation of this series, we will focus on Ibn Ezra as a scientist and as a philosopher, and delve into the swirling currents reflected in his writings. Joining us today to discuss this topic is Dr. Tzvi Langermann, a Professor Emeritus in the Department of Arabic at Bar Ilan University. Professor Langermann is a noted expert on medieval Jewish and Arabic thought, having published widely on the subject, including his latest book, Before Maimonides, a new philosophical dialogue in Hebrew, shortly to be published by Brill. More germane for our purposes today, Professor Langermann has also authored the article on Ibn Ezra in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which I certainly will recommend to all our listeners. It is a pleasure to welcome Professor Langermann to the podcast of Jewish Ideas today. Professor, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. And by the way, the Before Maimonides has come out since whenever I wrote that blurb that you saw. So it's been published by Brill now for a few months already.
Excellent. Well, in which case people should pick up a copy if they can. So let's dive right into this fascinating individual, Avraham Ibn Ezra. Let's begin a little bit by situating him historically. So if you could please outline for us when he lived, what his life and times were, what he spent his life doing, and give us a brief overview both of the biography and the context.
Okay, well, he was born in 1093 in Tudela, which is in Navarre, which is in the northern part of Spain, close to the border with France, present-day France. At the time, it was not yet the Kingdom of France, and this was a time of what they called in Arabic Muluk al-Tawaif. The Iberian Peninsula was split into a bunch of small regional, almost city-states, each with its own court and its own cultural interests. Now, Ibn Ezra at some point moved from Tudela to Cordoba, and apparently his longtime friend already from the north, the great poet Yehuda Halevi, came along with him, and he stayed in Cordoba for a while, and then he left Spain, and we don't really know why. Apparently, he got into some sort of mess. No one knows exactly what happened, and he began a life of wandering that took him to North Africa. He spent a good deal of time in Italy, where he wrote his biblical commentaries. Spent time in France, both speaking of modern France geographically, in the south and the Béziers, which had a strong Jewish community, and a lot of people who were interested in astronomy. He moved up north to Normandy, and eventually came to England, where he wrote his last work, Yesod Mora. I don't know exactly when he died, but apparently he died in Rome. So we don't have too many details about his life. What he tells us about his life is basically that he was a unlucky man. He was, as an astrology would say, born under a bad sign. If you know that blues song, he has a 2-line poem in which he says that the stars went out of their way to give him a bad fate in life, and had he chosen to go into the candle business, the sun would have never set, so there would be no darkness, and no one would need to buy candles. So he led a life of poverty and wandering, and this comes across strongly, particularly in Kohelet, his commentary on Kohelet. Kohelet, as I'm sure you all know, is sort of a pessimistic book to begin with, and he gives vent to his personal feelings of that in a commentary on Kohelet. He had a what I call less of a esoteric side to his writing, as more of a teasing style. I'll get to that maybe in detail, I hope, to with one particular passage as for illustration. So it's often hard to figure out what the secret is that he's hinting at, especially his biblical commentaries. And we don't have much help from his contemporaries because none of his contemporaries took to trying to ferret out what his real meaning was. This is because a few hundred years after his death, he died sometime in mid 12th century. I'm not very good at dates, but particularly in the 14th century, there was a spate of very large, deeply involved, philosophically informed super commentaries on his biblical commentary, but they are all trying to fit his remarks into what their own philosophical milieu, and it doesn't really jive too often. On the other hand, we do have some very interesting and personal encounters, debates, or conversations which he records that he held with his contemporary, his friend, possibly related by marriage, Yehuda Halevi, which gives us some strong insight, I think, into his personality and to his ideas.
I want to get to that to those discussions with Yehuda Halevi in a moment, because I agree with you. They are very fascinating, very revealing. Before we do, could you perhaps give us a sort of brief bird's eye view of his output? Because as I mentioned in the introduction, he's very wide ranging. He wrote a lot about a lot. So I mean, could you perhaps give a basic roadmap to those who don't know? What sort of things was he interested in? What did he write about? And perhaps when in his life he wrote about them, or how does his intellectual biography play out?
Well, I can give you a sort of a bird's eye view of his output and his and I'd like to take a moment to say go into a little detail about a few of the lesser known works, but I'm not really competent to talk about the order in which they were written. He wrote his major literary contributions were his very extensive biblical commentary, covering the whole Torah and a good part of the Nach, not all of it, and a whole set of astrological works, which were extremely popular, copied over many, many times. He also continued to work on them in the course of his life. Medieval authors would often, update or correct a book and then release sort of the second edition. It wasn't called second edition, but scholars see that the same text has some differences, which can be attributed to some interference or intervention by a copyist, but are very often just the author himself deciding to revise something. So it's and there are many dozens of manuscripts. And the late Shlomo Sela undertook a project that I thought no one would ever think of doing, and putting out editions, commentaries, translations on the astrological books. Now, these books, as I said, are for the most part short and do not go deeply into the mathematics. There is a lot of very involved and not at all simple spherical trigonometry and things of that nature in astrological forecasting and writing horoscopes and calculations. And his books, for the most part, hardly touch on that, which I think is part of the reason for success. It makes astrology very accessible. And so there's a whole list of these short works. Now, in addition, he wrote a sort of philosophical romance called Chai Ben Mekitz. This is actually a genre that several people contributed to. Several of the major Muslim thinkers, Ibn Bajjah, Ibn Sina, Suhrawardi, that basically portray the how, at least in the Islamic works, how someone who was sort of brought up by animals and away from all human civilization can, by dint of his own intellectual effort, come to a pretty much complete understanding of the cosmos, which leads in the philosophical view rampant at the time. It's really the only true path to knowledge of God. He also wrote a book called Yesod Mora, which I think we will talk about in more detail, which is an extremely interesting book. It sort of belongs to the Sefer Mitzvot genre, to which Sa'ad had contributed before him and Maimonides after him, but it's actually very, very different in conception and in content, and it gives us, again, a very good glimpse at his fundamental religious beliefs, his fundamental religious built on Shaun, what he thinks the religious life is all about and its goals and how the Torah helps us achieve them. Then finally, two other works which I would like to speak about a little bit more detail, not much, but he wrote a book on what we call arithmology. Arithmology is a branch of, or an outgrowth of Pythagoreanism, in which one goes through the numbers and at the same time goes through their arithmetic properties and sometimes their geometrical analogs, and then their analogs in the cosmos and the world of nature, and wherever else you can find them, including in religious laws and whatnot. It was a field that Philo of Alexandria had been active in, and it was a field developed by some, not too many, but by some important Jewish and Islamic thinkers. And his book, Sefer HaEchad, it belongs to this genre. I say this because even though he's famous for being, an astrologer and having astrology as one of the fundamental structural elements in his worldview, he is actually more of a Pythagorean. And there was I think numbers play a more basic role in his understanding of how the world is built and how all the different parts of the world, the physical and the metaphysical and so on, interrelate. So he has this book. But what's interesting is that it differs from all other books in the genre in that he only goes through the numbers 1 through 9. Mostly they go up to 10. And of course, 10 is a very rich number in terms of symbolism and the Asiriya Kodesh and things like that. But he only goes up to number 9. And then finally, I'd like to make just say a few things about his book called Sefer Hashem. Sefer Hashem, the book of the name. And people will say, well, it's a book on the divine names, and it is. But what does it tell us? Well, it tells us a lot. Coming back to the theme that I mentioned of Pythagoreanism and having numbers as the basic fundamental building block and whatever else you want to call it of the universe. He, for instance, points out that the letters of the Tetragrammaton, both the Yud He Yod Vav He and the He, so the letters Aleph, He, Vav, and Yud, or the numbers 1, 5, 6, and 10, all share the same property. And this property is that every higher power repeats in the final digit the original number. 1 to any power will be 1. 5, 25, 125, 625, the final digit is 5. 6, 36, 216, the final digit is 6. And 100, 10 and then to any power the 0. So this to me it indicates that the divine name is built of numbers that no matter how often you go to a higher power, there is an unchanging final digit, which has to do with, I think, perhaps, the sort of emanation where everything starts from 1, but the deity remains constant and unchanging in terms of here being preserved as the same final digit in every higher power. Along the same lines almost, he has a very interesting theory there, which I have my own take on it, which I given more detail in my article in the volume published by J. Harris and Isidore Tversky, where he basically identifies the two poles of the cosmos as the nodes where the divine intersects or touches the material world. The material world of the medieval conception, according to all, is a finite sphere which spins constantly. the outermost sphere spinning once in 24 hours, and then this according to most theories is sort of the engine in which the motions of all the motions of the planets and then of the elements are powered. Now, if you spin a ball and you hold it by the two poles, you run a line through the axis, and it hits the sphere in two points 180 degrees apart. You spin the ball. The only points that don't move are the poles.
Right.
And this again fits the idea of the unchanging deity, as in the unchanging final digit of the higher powers of those four numbers. And this is interesting in its own right, but it's also interesting because it's an important and I think much more substantive point of contact with some Islamic mystical thought than some of the things that are usually paraded as evidence of this influence. Because in Islamic thought, the kutub, which is the Arabic word for which the Hebrew kotev for pole is just a borrowing, is taken by some major Sufi thinkers such as Ibn Arabi, to be this same idea of being the place through which the deity intersects with the world. So in the system of Ibn Arabi, the pole is the preserver and maintainer of the universe, the mediator between the divine and the human. And I say that this is an idea that we have in Ibn Ezra as well in this Sefer Hashem. So these are his major works and a few deeper dives into some of them.
And so if I want to sum up that what you just said regarding the numbers, it seems to be a curious mix of numerology, paying close attention to numbers, but also connecting that to physics and astrophysics and the workings of the outer planets and the outer spheres, and that both of them reflect a kind of unity or a kind of perfect order, which points to the singularity of God or the singularity of the deity, something like that.
Well, first of all, I was careful to use the word arithmology, which is a term that's used to distinguish it from numerology, because this is not gematria. This is a science or genre that was developed by mathematicians who some of them had mystical inclinations, Iamblichus, Nicomachus, Philo, but not at all in the sense of gematria. And I don't recall that Ibn Ezra had anything to do with that. And this is something that is more fundamental, let me say, than the cosmos. These numbers do reflect themselves here and there in the heavens, but anyone with a basic understanding of astronomy knows that the numbers there are a lot messier. They don't work out as cleanly as they do in the things that they talk about in arithmology. It's like I said, it's a more fundamental role given to the numbers. As for the stars are basically, and this is not this is a view that's shared by a lot of people. They sort of manage, or rule, if you wish, activities in the lower world, but their role there is really connected intimately with the lower world. It's not as fundamental as the role of numbers.
Interesting. So this is a good segue. Let's talk about that, because one thing that many people know about Ibn Ezra is his um, yeah, tendency towards using astrology and using the positions of the stars and the sort of the zodiac signs, as it were, and really giving an enormous amount of credence to that and its power to shape events and lives here on Earth. In other words, he really thought there was an intimate connection between the two. And of course, this was much debated among Jewish thinkers of the medieval period. Maimonides famously coming out strongly against astrology or using astrological signs. So, could you talk a little bit about that? About Ibn Ezra's, why was he so fond of astrology? To what extent did he believe that it influenced or governed or dictated events down here below? And how did this intersect with other maybe elements of his philosophy?
Well, I'll get back to what I was saying before. He basically, and again, this is something that was held by many people, particularly those who are labeled accurately or probably not so accurately as Neoplatonists, that there are three worlds. There is the lower world, the earth at the center, which is, the world of beings that come to be and degenerate, and animals, go through their life cycle, trees go through their life cycle, humans go through their life cycle. It's sort of the lowest world. Then above that, there is the world of the stars, which is much more fixed and eternal. Those stars are in their orbits forever. If the world was created, then once they were put in their orbit, they stay there. If they were not, it's a world of fixed motions and fixed bodies. And then above that, there's the world of spiritual or metaphysical beings, angels, and so on, leading up to the deity. Now, the higher you go, the more authority you have, let us say. So the stars have authority over the lower world where humans live, and they do pretty much dictate events. They dictate events in a deterministic way. Let us say that if there is something that is foretold, it will happen, and often astrologers will exploit this. Not just astrologers, but fortune tellers, magicians, people like, well, for example, Bilam bin Baor, the man he was a paid curser. He was hired by kings to curse their enemies, and apparently they must have thought that he knew his business, because Balak wanted to hire him and pay him a hefty sum. Now, what was the story of Bilam? If you read Ibn Ezra's commentary, the first time that God reveals himself, or that there's a heavenly message sent to Bilam, he says that this was done for the glory, or to preserve the honor of Israel. What does he mean? At the end, right after the story of Bilam ends, with Bilam and Balak going their separate ways, after Bilam is not able to curse the Jews and Balak throws up his hands in despair, the next story is the story of the Jews fooling around with the Midianite women, and a plague coming and decimating the Jews. But if you read closely the biblical passages, it's not there made explicit that the plague is a punishment for the sin, because Moses is told basically to crucify or hang the Jewish leaders. And then we're told later on that when Pinchas kills the chieftain of the tribe of Shimon, that stopped the plague. Now, what Ibn Ezra has in mind here is that this, and he tells us that it's pretty explicit, that Bilam, as an astrologer, foresaw that there was a plague in the stars for the Jews in the near future. And he thought, great, I will, curse the Jews. And then this plague that's been in the stars since time eternity will come and hit the Jews. And Balak will think, oh, it's because of my curse. And so I've, another satisfied customer will pay me for cursing. And in order to thwart that, what God did was to not allow Bilam to curse. In other words, there was no interference, no divine intervention in changing the course of events and preventing the plague from happening. The way to prevent this was to not allow Bilam to curse, and he explains this in more detail in another place in his biblical commentary. If these disasters if they're associated with bad behavior, we call punishment. Well, what happens if we do tshuva, if we repent? And the answer, it's not that God will change the course of events and switch the astral indications. No, that's not what happens. What happens, he says, is that if this happens, then by chance, or assuming by chance, the prophet who has convinced the people to repent will tell them, let's all go out to the fields and have a prayer meeting. And that happens at the time that the natural disaster, say a river flooding, happens. So the way that the people are saved from punishment is not by an interference, by changing the predetermined course of events, which would have that river overflow its banks at that particular moment. That doesn't change. It's saved by having these people drawn out of the city at the particular time. So he's a very strong believer in astral determinism. And as I said, he's convinced that it's hit him hard personally because however he tries to make a living, he can't, and he's always broke.
This is fascinating, especially because we did an episode a few weeks ago on free will. And so I suppose you would say that for Ibn Ezra, the larger events, like let's say a river flooding, are predetermined and can be seen through the astrological signs. If you are proficient enough in reading the astrological signs, you could see what will come and therefore change your own personal behavior to ensure a better outcome for yourself. Which is quite a remarkable
The,
theory, let's say.
excuse me, but the better outcome does not involve nullifying the disaster foretold by the astrological analysis. It involves
Right, that's set in stone.
you're being directed to be somewhere else when whatever happens. You hear all the time about someone at the last minute couldn't make a plane and then that plane crashes, or and this is a sort of thing that he would say was, well, I mean, we too would say it's providential, but it's providential meaning that this person who for whatever reason deserved to be saved was simply diverted from the event rather than having God nullify the event, and that's the tough part. Now, well, the most problematic part for him here is not so much the question of free will. I don't really know how much he talks about that as a philosophical topic, but the question is, what special role is there for Israel? He, in many places, invokes the phrase "En Mazal Yisrael," and most people who have some familiarity with his thinking will say, well, Ibn Ezra thinks that that the Jews are immune from these astral destinies, but that's actually not true. If you read his astrological books, and he talks about the zodiacal signs and the stars that are assigned to each of the nations, Israel's right there with the others. It has its sign, it has its star, its planet. Uh, when he talks about the nations of the world are governed by angels and Israel is governed directly by God. Well, no, he has Israel being governed by Michael. So when speaking astrology to astrologers, it's clear that Israel has no special anthropological status being free from this. It's the way Ein Mazal Israel plays out in practice is exactly as I explained before. It means that if the Jews are behave themselves or repent, then there will be something to cause them to be at the right place at the wrong time, so that they don't get hit by this. And essentially, this could happen to any non-Jew as well. So it really comes down to it that there is a human way to avoid the stars. And basically, as he says, what you do is you're linking up with the world above the stars. I said there are three worlds. We're here in the lowest world. The stars are the middle world, and the angelic and spiritual realm is the higher world. If you are brought to the intellectual and moral and spiritual perfection, then you sort of become more part of the higher world, which puts you above the astral determinism, and then your life is somehow directed that you can escape whatever malfeasance the stars may have had in mind for you.
This is fascinating because it seems from your presentation here that Ibn Ezra was very committed to his system, and that the system essentially works, it's internally coherent and unbreakable. And even the conception of some sort of special chosenness or uniqueness of Am Yisrael, of the Jewish people. So even that has to be placed within the system. He doesn't allow for a kind of escape valve within it, and therefore, even within this perfectly coherent internal system, there has to be a way of interpreting it such that Jewish people could potentially have some sort of benefit, but nonetheless, this would be, as you say, at least in theory, open to others as well, because the rules of the system have to govern itself
So
perfectly.
you can see what kind of disagreement he would have had with his friend Yehuda Halevi, who was the major representative in his time of this special status for the Jewish people, which is built in and which is substantive, which is almost ontological. It's real, and that's something that Ibn Ezra would not accept.
So let's jump into that now a little bit before we move on to other parts. I mean, you mentioned this correspondence with Yehuda Halevi, who he was possibly related to as well by marriage. He is, and that they seem to have traveled together. They were both very important poets, both very both considerable Jewish thinkers and theorists of their time. What can we know from Ibn Ezra? What emerges from this correspondence with Yehuda Halevi? What were the major points of similarities or differences? How can our conception of Ibn Ezra be illuminated by this interaction?
Well, okay, I would like to talk about two features. One is the discussion which he gives in his commentary on the Ten Commandments, and he tells us that he was asked by Yehuda Halevi a very tough question. The first commandment opens, Anochi Hashem Elokecha Asher Hoseticha Me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. He says, if the strongest proof for God is his creation of the heaven and earth, and of course the creation of heaven and earth, the orderly cosmos, are things that are not particular to the Jewish people. Anyone who can, get to the bottom of those recondite issues can discover God there. Why does God introduce himself as the one who took us out of Egypt, an historical event that's of importance to Israel alone? Why doesn't he say, I'm the God who created heaven and earth? I think that's a powerful question. And Ibn Ezra says, well, it's complicated. It starts Anochi Hashem Elokecha. That's the part that that first part of the sentence is aimed at philosophers who can study the cosmos and the order and the beauty and come to the conclusion that God exists. And then it has the event of leaving Egypt, because if you know astrology, you know that at the very moment that God took the Jews out of Egypt, the astrological forecast was for them to remain in slavery. So if you know the two, if you know that, you can put two and two together and say, well, see, this was a divine intervention in God's part. Now, that's taking apart the sentence and making it, it's really so far removed from, what you would think when the Yehuda Halevi is saying, it's just God's calling card. Today we say, in identity, you have the right to, you should be the owner of your own identity, and to say, to the world who you are. And here's God saying to the world, I am the man, I am the being that took the Jews out of Egypt. So obviously, this is the defining event, the critical point, the most important point that God wants to be known by, and it's something that's of importance strictly to the Jews. And so this I think highlights the real not just the cleavage or break between Ibn Ezra and Halevi, but between Halevi and the philosophical trend which Ibn Ezra here just represents. I would also point out, and this is a point that I Karen was just making, whenever I get a chance, that it's wrong to say that this is a division between rational and irrational approaches. There's nothing irrational about Halevi's argument. I think it's much more. I mean, they're both maybe rational, but it's much more coherent to say that the sentence hangs together and that the subject and the predicate have something to do with each other. So I think that the way that Halevi is presented as being sort of irrational alternative to philosophy is wrong. Now that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to point out, and this is something that a point I've made, and I don't know that anyone else has said it or reacted to my point, is that it's my opinion that Ibn Ezra is the model for the philosopher in the beginning of the Kuzari. If you know, the Kuzari begins with the king of the Khazars has a dream that your contentions are worthy, your actions are not worthy. They're not acceptable to God. And this tells us right away that a point again that's missed by so many readers of the Kuzari, that the Kuzari is not about theology, but it's about praxis. Because if the king of the Khazars, when he's still a practicing pagan, can be have an angel tell him that your kavanatecha ritzuyot, or your niya, your tents are acceptable to God, then there's nothing wrong with his way of thinking. It's his actions. He goes in and tries every form of sacrifice and and whatever offering uh, you can think of, and there are rejected. And the ultimate point of the Kuzari said it's only the practices that encounter in the Torah, the specific sacrifices of the Sabbath and the holidays and the prayers that find favor in the eyes of God. Is just something that's inaccessible to human reason. It's God has given us this. It said these are the acts of worship that I want. Now, when the king of the Khazars has his dream, he calls in a Christian and a Muslim and then a philosopher. And the philosopher tells him, after giving him his spiel about the form and matter and so on and so forth, when the king of the Khazars tells him, "Yeah, but I want to know what I should do as an act of worship, because that's my problem. I don't know how to worship God. I don't know what acts, what sacrifices, will find favor." The philosopher says it doesn't matter. You can either choose any religion you want, including some of the practices of the philosophers, like the Pythagoreans, who had also had eating restrictions and all sorts of devotional acts. Or if none of them work for you, make up your own. This is the exact opposite of the Halevi's approach, which he ascribes to the philosophers, and this is exactly the position that some super commentators on Ibn Ezra found to be Ibn Ezra's opinion, including one figure not at all known called Shlomo Franco, who came across a Hermetic text called Datot Nevi'im, the religions of the philosophers, which describes Hermes, or in Hebrew he's Hanoch, who introduced the nations of the world to the worship of God. He established religions for the inhabitants of the seven climates, and each he gave an appropriate religion to the nature of that clime. There's a difference in sacrifices, in fast days, and so forth, are determined by your locale and things of that sort. And then Frankel says at the end, study this matter well, for from it you will be able to understand many things concerning the intent of the Torah, according to the opinion of the scholar of Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra. So he thinks that Ibn Ezra also has this notion of sort of religious relativism, and that the different religions, particularly in terms of their practices, their restrictions on our daily activities, their demands for worshiping at certain times and in certain forms, are all determined by the nature of these peoples, and there's nothing to pick and choose between them. No one has any inherent advantage over the others, uh, and he thinks this to be this, which is the view of the philosopher of the Kuzari, the view of Ibn Ezra. This, I think, makes a lot of sense to me, and it tells me that, at least in my view, that the philosopher here, the model that Halevi is drawing on, is his friend and companion and sparring partner in matters of thought, Ibn Ezra.
So, firstly, This is a wonderful theory, and I'm definitely going to stick that in my pipe and smoke it, as they say, because it's fascinating to think that Yehuda Halevi was writing the Kuzari, and the model of the philosopher, which is generally seen to be some sort of Aristotelian, some sort of just non-Jewish, expositor of philosophy itself. And there's actually his good friend Ibn Ezra, who, despite their closeness and despite their amity and friendship, he clearly saw as in some ways beyond the pale because of his philosophy. In fact, much of the early part of the Kuzari is a polemic against philosophy. It's also interesting, of course, because it's fascinating to consider the opposition between the two in terms of what would give more glory to God, as it were. In other words, is it better to conceive of God as the constructor, let's say the instigator of a great, perfect system, like Ibn Ezra, through which you could, by learning it, you could learn how to take advantage of it, learn how to predict things, learn how to operate within the system? Or for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the whole point is that no, that God, God interrupts the system. God, imposes himself within it and causes miracles to happen, and has a personal relationship and commands certain very specific things to very specific people, and appears much more as a personality. And that distinction is probably closer to what people mean between the rationalist and non-rationalist schools. As it seems to me, as you were drawing this very imperfect opposition between the two, it seems that's the major distinction. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's system is not irrational, but it is it predicates or depends upon God as being much more interventionist and unpredictable, let's say, than a system of Ibn Ezra.
Well, I think that could be an analysis of their positions, but what I would like to talk about here is that actually where they both really seem to have in mind is in terms of goals is the same devotional aspect, and this comes across strongest in their poetry, because the poems of both, but we're talking about here about Ibn Ezra, even if there are some hints at or even citations of philosophical terms, they are so powerful in expressing his deep, this deep urge, his deep lust to find favor in the eyes of God and to come close to God, that you sort of forget all the more philosophical or scientific abstract notions of how one comes to know God. And this is an aspect of Ibn Ezra which I think really has to be emphasized, particularly because it's had such strong impact through the generations, and it's even getting stronger now. One of the most powerful liturgies that he wrote, I'm sure you're familiar with it, L'cha Eli Teshukati. You are the object of my lust. You are the object of my desire, which is sung, which is chanted in Sephardi congregations on the Leil of Yom Kippur. But it's also become a very popular tune in Israel, with several of the major Israeli singers performing it and getting millions of views on YouTube. And not just that, but there are places here, especially yeshiva, which is maybe half the students are Sephardi and half the students are Ashkenazi, and they want at Yom Kippur to have some joint service where they all participate and say the same thing. Whatever that takes place that I've noticed, the first choice is always L'cha Eli Teshukati. I personally hurry to shul because they say it before the Kol Nidre. It's because it's so powerful, and it's powerful particularly at the end, where he talks about that he knows that he's human, his life is finite, he will eventually die, and then he's sort of imagining that how it would be if he's actually been successful in a religious quest, and when his soul or ascends to heaven, the angels come out and greet him and say, "Welcome, welcome." It's so powerful, and you forget all the different theories about the afterlife and the soul and whatnot, and just have this feeling of this person that's been going through life, suffering, trying to figure things out, and hoping that in the end he'll be welcome into heaven. Now, there are other ways to look at this. You could, for instance, if you were interested, and now everyone seems to be interested in looking at Islamic influences or resonances. Well, tashukati, my lust, my desire, obviously it calls to mind to anyone who knows Arabic the word ishq, which means the same thing, and which is a key element in Sufi thought. So you could do the type of things that academics like to have fun with, churning out papers about the influence of Sufism and Ibn Ezra and this term and so on. You can do that, and I'm not saying it's not legitimate. But I'm saying you miss the point if you don't get the pathos, the feeling that this causes within. The same thing with his tzama nafshi. My soul is thirsty for you. Now this was something that he wrote. Technically speaking, it's what's called a reshut for nishmat on Shmini Atzeret. Nishmat Kocha, is a prayer that's said on holidays and Sabbaths. And in medieval liturgical poetry, there are these things called the Reshuyot, where the chazan or the cantor, the prayer leader, asks the congregation to accept him as their spokesperson before God. But this was taken off. This was taken out of that context, its original context, and put into the Sabbath Zemirot book to be sung at the Sabbath table. And again, if it's a really powerful poetry, and this brings up the devotional aspect, which I think is where all this stuff comes to a head in terms of the most powerful urging of the soul and the things that people can relate to, whether or not they have any philosophical background or not. It's amazing.
And therefore, this leads me into the obvious question, which is you have these two Ibn Ezras. You have the Ibn Ezra, the philosopher, who has this very impersonal system that is mediated through the astrological signs and is comes close to sounding like a deterministic system of some kind, at least as larger events in the world happen, and tries to minimize a kind of direct interface between humans and God in that respect. And yet, he's also the author of this amazing poetry. And you read it. I mean, it's truly extraordinary. My favorite poem of Ibn Ezra is the Zemer that some sing on Shabbat, which is Tzama Nafshi, right? Elechad Bra'ani, V'amar Chayani, etc. It's an extraordinary, as you say, very emotional, very devotional, very pathos filled, and you can really see that this flows from the pen of someone who has a deep spiritual existence, as it were, and pours it out into his writings. And then the question becomes, how do you reconcile the two? In other words, do you see a smooth single personality that can encompass Ibn Ezra the philosopher and Ibn Ezra the devotional poet at the same time?
I do, because I think that if you it doesn't begin with Ibn Ezra, and it's not limited to him. And in fact, there is a very famous book that should be read by everyone by Pierre Hadot, uh, in French, but it's translated into English. That philosophy was, for many, a way of life. That's how it was conceived, even by the Greeks, where Plato calls it preparation for death, which is what comes across in Lechali Tsukati. So, what you can, sort of artificially, not artificially, but actually it's important to separate the two, because you want to have your devotional power, your devotional pathos focused on the correct target. The problem with people who don't never given any consideration to the philosophical dimension, the philosophical descriptions or whatever of God, is that, as Maimonides tells us, in his parable of the Sultan's palace, they're standing with their backs to the palace and praying into the wilderness. So you have to know what is the object, to what are you praying. But when you give vent to this, the pathos takes over, and this is true even for someone as dry perhaps as Maimonides. When you read the certain his description in the Mishnah Torah of someone who loves God is like someone who loves a woman and can't get her out of his mind, no matter how hard he tries. It's something many people can relate to, especially when they're a lot younger than I am now. But what's amazing is that when he writes this stuff out in prose, it doesn't come across that as coherently and as fluidly as it does when he boxes himself into the poems with meter and rhyme and whatnot, and yet he manages to write something even keeping to the rhyme and the meter and all the technical requirements of poetry, which is so easily understandable. If you know that the Jewish prayers on the high holidays, so many of them come from the Kalir, where the tongue twisters. They're words that you need to be an expert in Hebrew lexicography to get some idea of what they mean. And here you're supposedly praying for your life, and at the pinnacle of religious experience. And when you have these things like L'chaili Teshukati, which is so clear and fluid, and when you say it, you identify strongly with everything it says because you understand what it says, and he's sort of expressing what I would like to say, but I could never say it that well.
Right. Okay, fascinating. I would like to move on to one or two final topics. One of them is the book that you mentioned earlier called Yesod Mora. It's a fascinating short work, as many of his works are. It's one of those few works where he really does try, I think, to outline a kind of philosophy on broad topics. So can you perhaps talk to us a little bit about that? What does that book say? Why is it an important book? And what are the major arguments he's proposing in that work?
Well, the book is perhaps technically belongs to the genre of the Sefer Mitzvot that, as you know, as a rule, basically enumerate the 613 biblical commandments. But Ibn Ezra rejects the count of 613, which everyone knows it's almost artificial, but he rejects it outright and says they're almost infinite if you look at the instantiations in everyday life. And he instead tries to classify the commandments in terms of their manifestation as either commandments that have to do with a specific time or place, commandments that have to do with certain groups of people, and so on. But then he goes on to talk about the commandments that are universal, eternal ones, because he has this notion, the same notion that you have in logic and in science, as he describes, of universals and particulars, where the particulars are always changing and maybe are almost infinite, but the universals are fixed numbers and unchanging. And he tries to get at the universal, the most sort of sweeping commandment with the greatest compass. And interestingly, he decides that the commandment that answers that is the fear of God. Now, we all know about this distinction in Jewish thought between love of God and fear of God, but he does this because, he says because it's an explicit verse. Et Hashem Elokecha tira v'oto ta'avod, which you can read as a sort of conditional sentence. If or when you fear God, then you will worship him. So the true path, the only real path, or the first step to worshiping God is fear of God, and that includes all the commandments. We usually people classify the fear of God as the collection of prohibitions, which we don't violate out of fear of being punished, and then love of God as the positive commandments, the acts that we willingly do in order to find favor with God. But he says that the fear of God includes all of them. And then he goes into a rhapsody almost of sorts of how this ties into the purpose of life. He says that the fear of God will train us and get us into the habit of being of clinging to God, because this is the reason that we were created. We were not created to make a lot of money, which will eventually be left to someone else when we pass on, not to build buildings which eventually will be taken over by others while we've moved from our home here to our home beneath the ground, not to take pleasure in food because it takes a long time to prepare them. But to prepare it, you enjoy it just for a few minutes, and it usually is not good for your health. And it goes on like that. It goes on. So he has a lot here to say about the purpose of life. Now, another interesting thing here, and it's a point of contact with Maimonides. I think there are many points of contact which should not be taken to be indications of influence, because the points of departure are so different, and the contexts in which they're developed are so different. It doesn't seem relevant. But he, like Maimonides, rejects Saadia's distinction or division into what he calls mitzvot shimiot and mitzvot, this distinction between commandments that have a rationale and we understand why we do them, and commandments that have no obvious rationale, and Saadia will say, well, these are things that we simply do to manifest our obedience to God. There's no reason, there's no other goal intended than just to manifest our obedience to God. And Ibn Ezra, again, like one of these, connects us to the fact that humans are rational thinking beings, and therefore all the commandments have some underlying rationale, though we don't always know it. Going back to the red heifer, the paraduma, he doesn't try to find a rationale for it, but he does find a rationale for one part of it in his commentary in the Torah, which it takes away from Yesod Mora, but the Torah tells us to sprinkle the fluid that has the ashes of the red heifer on third and seventh day. And he says, Ibn Ezra says that the secret of this law is that 3 is the same thing as 7. He says, "V'yadua ki b'sod ha'cheshbon ha'shlishi kemo ha'shvi'i."
What does he mean by
What
that?
does that? Where is 3 like 7? This is the type of thing that drove his super commentators, the people 100, 200 years later, were trying to figure out what he was saying, and based on what they knew from Maimonides and Averroes and so on. What's 3 like 7? You could say that close to what I was talking about earlier, that one person suggests that if you square 3 and you square 7, the squares have the same last digit of 9, which is nice, but that's not enough it's not the same digit that you began with. So it's not the same thing as we're talking about with the 1, 5, 6, and 10. What he has in mind, and I'm pretty convinced of this, and I've seen it in some super commentators, is the idea of critical days in Greek medical theory, which is that an illness will reach a crisis. Crisis in Greek means judgment on the 3rd day, and then later on the 7th day. In other words, it developed, and the 3rd day is the turning point. Either it'll turn for the better, and the person will begin to become healthy again, or go get worse and eventually be fatal. And so having this indicates to me not just the role of numbers, but that there is a very important and substantive analogy between religion and medicine, which that ties into the notion of religious relativism, because the idea is that it's just as the doctor will prescribe a regimen of health, healthy living, healthy lifestyle. Whatever they prescribe for you will depend on your age, your gender, your body build, and so on. So it has to fit the person. So also the religious regimen has to fit the person. And again, this leads us to say the idea of religious relativism. So I should add here that Ibn Ezra was not a great halachist, and many people, some people have suggested he really didn't know halacha at all. Uh, but he wasn't didn't write this book because of some urge to contribute to legal theory, but rather to classify commandments and thereby get a handle on eventually what life is all about.
So and sort of, I suppose the reason you brought up this this case of the Parah Adumah and the third and the seventh day is, and to connect it to Greek medical science, is supposed to show that to heal, again, I'm paraphrasing, to heal to heal the affliction, essentially, has to be that the ritual has to be in line with some kind of innate rationality that that is connected to how the world functions. Essentially, it's not coincidence it's third and seventh day, because it connects to how it works in I suppose sort of.
I think you're right, and I think that's why it's interesting that he doesn't even take a guess in a chapter in Yesod Mora on what he says, what he classifies as commandments whose rationale is unknown. He does try to get at the rationale of some, but he doesn't even try with a red hyphen, which is, as you know, the classic example, the paragon in Jewish law of a commandment that seems to have be a chukah, to be just a whimsical decree that has no rationale. And you're right, I agree with you there that by finding rationale for a one element of the ritual indicates that he sees some rationality in the entire ritual. And this ties in also with his relationship with Saadia and this whole messy business of who influenced who and what. He's rejecting Saadia for claiming that some laws have no rationale, and he dismisses a certain remark that Saadia makes with the red hypha in the first verse. But then he follows Saadia insofar as Saadia, as far as I understand, said that even if the commandment as a whole has no rationale, we can sometimes find the reasoning behind some of the details of it.
Right. Time is really running short, so I suppose I want to ask one last major question, which is Ibn Ezra's general place in the history of Jewish philosophy, because most books that are dedicated to Jewish philosophy, the history of Jewish philosophy, will mention Ibn Ezra. He is there, and certainly not as large a figure as, say, Maimonides or Saadia Gaon or others. But what would you say is his position, and also, I suppose, classification as well? Meaning, can he be grouped in with what is generally known as the rationalist school of Saadia and Rambam and Albo and others? Do you think his place is really there, considering that he has all these other interests and all these other sort of tendencies which the others don't have? And do you see him as a significant influence in the world of Jewish philosophy, or is his major influence in the world of exegesis, poetry, other things?
I think he's certainly a rationalist, and in his day, astrology was a rational science. At least it claimed to have a foundation in empirical foundation. I would, as I indicated earlier, I would probably call him, if anything, a Pythagorean in terms of his thought, and the Pythagorean and Pythagoras or Pythagoreanism had a revival in late antiquity among the Neoplatonists. So you get that in, but these labels are not helpful, and people who are extremely expert in Greek Neoplatonism as well as Jewish thought, such as the late Shlomo Pinas. He told me in a private conversation that he thought the whole thing, the Neoplatonism, is a misnomer. So let's just call him a rationalist. He had, as I said, a strong revival in the 14th, 15th century when people were writing these long super commentaries, trying to and sort of doing a sort of amalgam of Ibn Ezra and Maimonides, but nonsense, because he doesn't really, his first of all, his views are so on the questions of the day, the choice of Israel, free will, and things of that sort, are so strongly tied to astrology that there's really hardly any room for him today. But his particular ideas do come across in exegesis. In exegesis, of course, I think he had a much longer afterlife, and shouldn't rule out just mentioning, though it's not something that I know much about, his influence among Christian scholars, not just astrologers, but exegetes. So he certainly deserves a place in history books because we don't put people in history books just because they have an important place on our contemporary agenda. We do it out of intellectual interest, and I think he certainly should have a place. But I would not call him a systematic philosopher. He's a thinker with many interesting ideas and drawing on many different traditions, and should be taken for what he is.
Okay, I think that that'll have to do with that, because we are going to have other conversations with other scholars on different parts of Ibn Ezra. As you mentioned, the poetic part and the exegetical part.
Yeah.
But this has certainly been a fascinating introduction and a very important first step and foundational background to Ibn Ezra, the philosopher, the scientist, the thinker. So we are very grateful. Thank you, Professor Langermann, for coming on. And we hope to see you again sometime in the future. This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Elisha Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Elisha Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.